What if the war was not breaking because of one giant defeat, but because one 16-kilometer breach exposed every lie holding it together? What if that opening in the south was not the story itself, but the warning that the entire front behind it was already starting to collapse? And before we pull this apart piece by piece, do one quick thing. If you want serious stories told with clarity instead of noise like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with one person who wants the deeper truth. A map can look calm even when an army is dying inside. That is the first thing people miss when they watch a war from far away. They look for giant arrows, dramatic explosions, and cities changing hands overnight. But many collapses do not begin with fireworks. They begin with a failure so small that commanders think they can hide it. A trench abandoned too early, a road no longer safe at night, a radio call that never gets answered, a platoon that goes forward and does not come back. Then one morning, somebody notices that the line is not where it used to be. It is bent. Then it has opened. Then suddenly everyone understands that the breach is not 16 kilometers because the enemy was magically stronger that day. It is 16 kilometers because the structure behind that line was already hollow. That is why this moment matters so much. A breach of that size on the southern front is not just about terrain. It is about trust. It is about supply. It is about timing. It is about whether exhausted men still believe somebody behind them knows what they are doing. Once that belief starts to die, the map begins to move faster than the public can understand. And the signs were there long before the gap became impossible to ignore. Reports from the front kept pointing to the same pattern. Russian soldiers describing one reality in public reports and a completely different reality in private messages. Units being told to hold positions that were no longer properly supplied. Casualties being blurred, delayed, or buried inside paperwork. On paper, the line still existed. In real life, it was being held together by fear, confusion, and habit. That is a dangerous way to fight any war. But it is an especially dangerous way to fight in the South, where distance matters, roads matter, and one breach can quickly turn into pressure on logistics, artillery routes, drone teams, and reserve movement. Once a gap opens, it is not only the men standing inside that gap who are in danger. Every unit next to it suddenly has a new problem. Their flank is exposed, their routes become longer, their retreat becomes harder. The confidence that kept them in place begins to evaporate, and that is when collapse starts to spread without always looking dramatic. One of the clearest signs is not movement on the map. It is the human voice. When soldiers begin speaking with the tone of men who no longer believe in the story above them, that matters more than propaganda videos, more than patriotic speeches, and sometimes more than official battlefield claims. Because a frightened soldier can still fight. An angry soldier can still fight, but a soldier who feels abandoned is standing at the edge of a mental cliff. Some of the most revealing footage in this war has not shown tanks. It has shown faces. A dim trench, a shaky phone, a tired man speaking in fragments. Not the language of glory, not the language of victory, the language of someone who knows the official version is false. The most powerful detail in these moments is not always what is said. It is the feeling underneath it. You can hear a man realizing that the machine he serves does not see him as a person. It sees him as a number that can be replaced, hidden, or erased. And when enough soldiers reach that realization, the breach on the map becomes only the physical expression of a much deeper break, because wars are fought with fuel, shells, and vehicles. But they are also fought with confidence. If troops believe reinforcements are coming, they hold longer. If they believe evacuation is possible, they hold longer. If they believe the command knows the truth, they hold longer. Remove those beliefs one by one, and even a large force begins to behave like a trapped force. That is why communication matters so much here. When communication breaks down, everything becomes heavier. Orders arrive late or not at all. Units fire on old coordinates. Men sit in positions after those positions have lost meaning. Families hear nothing. Rumors replace planning. Panic replaces discipline. And in that environment, every kilometer of pressure feels twice as large. There have been reports and images suggesting just how desperate this has become. Soldiers struggling to get signal. Soldiers relying on unsafe methods just to send a message. Soldiers cut off not only from comfort, but from basic awareness of what is happening around them. That is not a side issue. That is the bloodstream of an army failing. Think about what that does to the mind. You are told to hold. You do not know what happened to the unit on your left. You cannot confirm whether the unit on your right still exists. Your commander gives optimism, but the sounds at night tell a different story. Drones keep appearing. Supply runs become rarer. The wounded wait longer. The dead are mentioned less. Then you hear that somewhere nearby, a section of the line has broken open. Not one trench, not one tree line, 16 kilometers. At that point, the breach becomes bigger inside the mind than on the ground. Because now every soldier asks the same question. If they could not stop that, who is stopping what comes next? This is where the Southern Front becomes more than a battlefield story. It becomes a story about system failure. The easiest way to misunderstand a war is to think collapse only happens when one side runs out of men. That is not always true. Armies often collapse first in meaning, then in movement. First, they stop understanding why they are suffering. Then they stop believing suffering will lead anywhere. Then they begin to look for survival outside the mission. And survival can take many forms. Sometimes it means refusing an order in private. Sometimes it means delaying movement. Sometimes it means pretending not to hear. Sometimes it means disappearing into the chaos. And sometimes it means the most direct act of all, surrender. That is one of the most important and least understood parts of this war. Surrender is not only a military event, it is a psychological referendum. It tells you what soldiers believe about tomorrow. Men do not lay down their weapons just because they are tired. They do it when the future promised by their own side starts to look worse than the danger in front of them. According to Ukrainian projects that track and process surrender cases, thousands of Russian soldiers have entered surrender channels since the full-scale invasion began. The exact totals are debated depending on the source and the date, but the trend matters more than any single number. The longer the war goes on, the more surrender becomes thinkable. That alone tells you something is deeply wrong. Because surrender spreads like an idea before it spreads like an event. First, a soldier hears that someone made it out alive. Then he hears that prisoners were fed, treated, and not immediately killed. Then he hears that there are organized instructions, hotlines, procedures, even ways to approach safely. Once those ideas enter the trench, fear changes shape. Now the fear is not only of the enemy, now the fear is of staying where you are. And that changes the entire meaning of discipline. A healthy army tries to keep soldiers fighting through leadership, trust, and purpose. A failing army relies more and more on punishment, secrecy, and terror. The reason is simple. If men are staying because they believe, you need one kind of command. If men are staying only because they are trapped, you need another. If you've made it this far, here's your battlefield checkpoint. Tap like if you want more scripts that cut through propaganda, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and send this video to a friend who follows the war but wants the bigger picture, not just the daily headlines. Now, look at what happens when technology enters that human breakdown. For most of history, surrender was a deeply human moment. A face, a gesture, a shouted plea, a pause between enemies. But this war keeps producing scenes that feel as if they came from the future. A drone hovering overhead, guiding movement, a robot on the ground, armed and watching, software identifying gestures, men stepping out of ruins with their hands up, not always in front of another man, but in front of a machine that may decide whether they live for the next 10 seconds. That image matters because of what it says about trust. Imagine the level of desperation required for a soldier to feel safer appealing to a robot than relying on the officers who sent him there. Imagine what that says about the chain of command behind him. Machines are frightening, but machines are predictable. They do not pretend. They do not flatter. They do not promise evacuation and then disappear. In some twisted way, a machine governed by rules can seem more merciful than a command culture governed by denial. And then we come to one of the darkest parts of this story. There have been repeated accusations and reported cases suggesting that Russian troops trying to surrender have been targeted by their own side, including by drones. Every such incident sends a message far beyond the people involved. The message is brutal and simple. Your life belongs to the system until the moment the system decides your death is more useful than your survival. That is how terror replaces loyalty. And it can work for a while. It can force men forward for one more assault. It can stop one more retreat. It can silence one more witness. But terror has a hidden cost. It teaches soldiers that their greatest danger may not always be the enemy in front of them. Once that lesson becomes normal, the soul of the army begins to rot. This is why that 16-kilometer breach should not be viewed as an isolated tactical event. It is the visible edge of a deeper moral fracture. A front does not usually open that wide unless many smaller failures lined up first. Planning failures, rotation failures, communication failures, logistics failures, truth failures, human failures, and behind all of them sits one central tension. Can a state keep demanding sacrifice after its soldiers stop believing sacrifice means anything? That question is bigger than one battle. It is bigger than one season. It goes to the heart of whether this war machine can still generate obedience faster than it generates despair. The answer becomes even clearer when we look at who has been sent to fight. Over time, more reports have described troops with weak preparation, poor training, limited cohesion, and low motivation. Some were mobilized fast, some came from economic desperation. Some entered with almost no clear understanding of what kind of battlefield they were being thrown into. That matters because modern war is unforgiving. If you send undertrained men into a drone-heavy, artillery-heavy, surveillance-heavy environment, they do not slowly become veterans. Many of them become casualties before they even understand the rhythm of the front. That creates a cruel cycle. Poorly prepared troops perform badly. Commanders respond with more pressure. More pressure produces more concealment and dishonesty. Dishonesty produces worse decisions. Worse decisions produce bigger losses. Bigger losses require more replacements. And because quality is falling, the replacements often arrive less prepared than the men they replace. This is how an army can look large and still become fragile. Numbers alone do not save a force when the internal quality is falling. In some ways, a huge but decaying system is more dangerous for its own soldiers than a smaller but coherent one. It can keep feeding men into failure for a very long time. And that is where the Southern Front tells us something terrifying. A breach is not always the result of a sudden enemy miracle. Sometimes it is simply the moment when reality finally catches up with denial. For months, maybe longer, the system may have been consuming vehicles, burning ammunition, hiding losses, stretching units, and improvising solutions that look temporary. Then one section weakens, then another, then pressure converges. And suddenly the map shows in one shape what the soldiers had already been feeling for weeks. And nothing reveals that better than the equipment story. One of the clearest signs of degradation in this war has been the growing use of vehicles that feel painfully out of place in modern frontline combat. Open vehicles, light transport, civilian-style platforms, motorbikes, makeshift movement systems that might help speed for a moment but offer almost no protection against shrapnel, drones, machine gun fire, or mines. Yes, speed matters. Yes, mobility matters. But there is a point where improvisation stops looking adaptive and starts looking desperate. When soldiers are pushed forward in machines that cannot protect them, everyone understands the message. The mission matters. The body inside does not. Open source analysts and defense watchers have spent years tracking visible losses in armor and heavy equipment across this war. Exact totals vary by methodology, and visually confirmed losses never show the entire battlefield picture, but the broad direction is hard to miss. The cost in vehicles has been enormous. And when armored capacity is burned faster than it can be properly restored, strange substitutes begin to appear. That is not innovation in the heroic sense. Often it is decay trying to wear the mask of creativity. That is the cruelty of late-stage attrition. The battlefield does not care about desperate improvisation. It punishes weakness immediately. And soldiers know this. They know when they are being sent in a vehicle that was never meant to carry them into a kill zone. They know when a tactic exists less to win ground than to consume time, force reaction, or fill a hole in the line. They know when they are being spent. So once again, the breach in the South is not only geographic, it is emotional. It is structural. It is symbolic. It tells every man near that front that the machine may no longer be able to hide its condition. And here is the deeper danger for Moscow. When collapse begins in public, it starts teaching people how to interpret every new event. A failed assault is no longer just a failed assault. It becomes proof. A new surrender is no longer isolated. It becomes pattern. A new video from a trench is no longer rumor. It becomes confirmation. That is how narrative control breaks. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until even small incidents are read as evidence of a larger unraveling. Here's a second quick mission for you. If this story is opening your eyes, drop a like right now, subscribe before the next chapter lands, and share this video with someone who still thinks front lines collapse only when cities fall. Sometimes the real collapse starts long before that. Now let's talk about the other side of the comparison. One reason this conflict looks so different, depending on which army you study, is that motivation is not distributed equally. Ukraine is fighting under the pressure of survival. That does not make every decision good. It does not make every unit perfect. But it creates something powerful, a clear reason to endure. When people believe their land, homes, and national future are directly at stake, that belief can carry them through levels of pain that would shatter a force built mainly on coercion. This matters because morale is not just emotion, it is combat power. A soldier who believes the line must hold thinks differently under fire. A drone team defending its own towns works differently. An engineer laying mines for the protection of his own people moves differently. Purpose does not erase fear, but it changes what fear is competing against. That contrast may be the single most important factor in understanding why a southern breach can become so politically dangerous. If one side is fighting with clearer purpose while the other side is fighting through concealment, coercion, and fatigue, then every rupture carries different meaning for each camp. For Ukraine, a breach can become proof that resistance still works. For Russia, the same breach can become proof that the promises made from above are no longer matching the reality below. And once promises lose their grip, numbers start to look different too. Official claims, recruitment drives, replacement rates, equipment repairs, battlefield summaries, victory language, all of it begins to face a harder question. Even if more men can be sent, what kind of men are they, and what are they being sent into? That is where the cost of a long war becomes merciless. Experienced personnel are lost, training pipelines thin out, junior leaders inherit chaos. Technical maintenance becomes harder, simple tasks become harder, units lose memory, cohesion declines. The system keeps moving, but more of its movement becomes waste. This is why a war can look sustainable on television and unsustainable in practice. The machine still launches attacks, the flags still wave, the speeches still happen, but the quality underneath is falling. Frontline soldiers notice first, then drone footage notices, then evacuation delays notice, then graveyards notice, and finally maps notice. When the map notices, it is already late. That is why the 16-kilometer breach feels so important. Not because it is the largest event in the war, not because one breakthrough decides everything, but because it may be one of those rare moments when the public can suddenly see what the soldiers have been feeling long before the analysts finish their charts. A collapsing front does not always scream, sometimes it whispers through absences. A unit that no longer answers, a road no one uses in daylight, a village abandoned faster than expected. A sudden spike in surrender attempts, an attack carried out with stripped-down vehicles instead of armor, a drone chasing men who should have been rescued, a commander speaking of stability while the line bends behind him. Put those signs together, and the picture becomes hard to ignore. This is not the image of a confident force moving toward victory. It is the image of a system paying a rising price just to postpone recognition. And recognition is coming anyway, because reality has a way of leaking out through a trench video, through a captured call, through satellite images, through the testimony of prisoners, through the dead, through the silent spaces where experienced units used to be. And that may be the most dangerous thing of all for any war effort. Not loss itself, but loss without believable purpose. People can endure terrible suffering if they believe it leads somewhere. Once they stop believing that, every funeral becomes an accusation. Every missing son becomes a political fact. Every hidden casualty becomes a crack in the story. Every surrender becomes an alternative. Every breach becomes a forecast. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a war in which the Southern Front may be showing the future before the future has fully arrived. Not a clean collapse, not a cinematic ending. Real collapse is messier than that. It comes in waves. A line stabilizes, then weakens somewhere else. Reinforcements slow the fall, but do not restore belief. A tactical patch hides a strategic disease. And then the next breach opens in a system that has become harder and harder to repair. That is why the real question is not whether one line can be rebuilt tomorrow. The real question is whether the human foundation underneath the line can still carry the weight being placed on it. Can tired men hold when they no longer trust the reporting above them? Can frightened men attack when they suspect retreat is punished more than failure? Can undertrained replacements restore sectors that experienced soldiers could not hold? Can machines, censorship, and fear substitute for purpose? Not forever. And history is full of armies that learned that too late. They looked large until they suddenly looked fragile. They sounded confident until one breach changed the tone of everything. They punished truth-tellers until truth arrived through disaster. They kept demanding sacrifice until sacrifice stopped producing results. Then one day, the world did not ask whether they were winning. The world asked how much longer they could keep going like this. If this video gave you a sharper view of the war, lock in with the channel now. Hit like, subscribe for the next deep breakdown, and share this with one person who needs to understand that collapse is not always one explosion. Sometimes it is 1,000 hidden failures, finally becoming visible at once. In the end, that may be the true meaning of the 16-kilometer breach. Not that one front line moved, not even that one side gained ground, but that the gap made something impossible to hide. It revealed that the Southern Front may not be held together by strength at all. It may be held together by inertia, fear, and silence. And those are weak materials. Because silence cannot carry ammunition. Fear cannot repair armor. Censorship cannot restore trust. Threats cannot create skilled soldiers. Punishment cannot build morale. And lies cannot close a breach once men on the ground know the truth. That is why this story should not be read as one more dramatic episode in a long war. It should be read as a test. A test of whether a system built on control can survive the moment when control no longer reaches the trench. A test of whether men treated as expendable will continue acting as if they believe. A test of whether pressure from the front and pressure from reality can be resisted at the same time. For a while, maybe yes. For a while, force can still move bodies. For a while, propaganda can still shape distance. For a while, fresh men can still be thrown into old failures. But the bill always comes due. And when it does not ask what the official statement said. It asks what the soldiers knew. It asks what the maps showed. It asks who could still communicate, who could still move, who could still believe, and who finally decided that survival mattered more than obedience. That is the shadow hanging over the South tonight. Not just the danger of more movement, not just the possibility of another breakthrough, but the possibility that everyone involved now understands something they can never fully unlearn. If one 16-kilometer breach appeared this way, then the front was never as solid as it claimed to be. And once an army starts fighting its own truth as much as it fights the enemy, the collapse is no longer only ahead of it. The collapse is already inside it. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. That is what makes it so revealing. And that is why the sound coming from the Southern Front may not be the sound of one battle at all. It may be the sound of a whole system beginning to come apart, one hidden failure at a time.